And it was especially exciting for me because this year is a Shemitah year, and a Shemitah is a topic that has fascinated me for a long time. And perhaps more importantly, it's something that I felt like I really didn't know all the details about because I don't live in Israel and it only happens once every 7 years. And it was an area that I felt like I could really, in researching for the classes and also hearing other people's perspectives, I could really learn, not just teach. So I'm really excited to do that together. And again, thank you so much for coming. Before I share a screen, I'm just going to give a bit of a framing of both the series that we're going to do and also this particular class. So as Rav Stephen said, the series is going to be 3 weeks, three shiurim, 3 classes, starting today and the next 2 Tuesdays as well. And today we're going to be talking about Shemitat Karka, which is the agricultural Shemitah, which obviously we will define in a minute. Next week, we're going to be talking about Shemitat Ksafim, the financial Shemitah. And the final week, we're going to be talking about what in the title says sacred salad, the practical laws and how to practically fulfill Shemitah this year, both in Israel for visiting and also wherever we are. So having said that, that was kind of like the macro framing. Now I'm going to get into the micro framing of this of today's shiur, of today's class. So there's going to be it's a source sheet with basically 3 sections. The first section is not Torah sources per se, but it's just sources that I found, resources discussing what environmental justice is, what the problems that led to sort of the conclusion of environmental justice is, and what the solution of environmental justice is. That's the first step. The second part of the shiur, the second set of sources, is what does the Torah have to say about environmental justice? Does the Torah have to say anything? Is the Torah for it, against it? What are the Torah sources that speak about environmental justice? And I'm going to argue that it's Shemitah that really addresses environmental justice from a Jewish angle in a very special way. Transitioning into the third set of sources, which is going to be talking about, okay, but what's special about the Torah's take on environmental justice? Is the Torah just saying, in 21st century lingo, it's good to do environmental justice? Or is there anything unique about what the Torah is saying that maybe our society is lacking, that is not necessarily around and spoken about, even for those who are aware of the issues of environment and its justice-related problems? Is there an issue that the Torah speaks about that's special, that's unique, that can be a particular Torah contribution to this discussion that's going on in our times? Before I share a screen, any questions, comments before we begin? Okay, so I'm going to share my screen now to the source sheet. And what I will ask as I share a screen is that let's do 3 different sections for questions and comments. Okay, let's do, I will indicate when we finish sort of part 1, set 1, set 2, and set 3. And at those intervals, we'll have a conversation, hopefully. And I really encourage us to have a conversation because, again, these are things that I'm learning about as well. I'd love to hear everyone's perspectives, but let's keep our questions and comments for those 3 intervals. Okay. So the first, as I said, the first set of sources, just sort of defining why environmental justice is a thing, so to say. So can we see the first source completely? Is that good? Okay, great. So can I'd love to ask for somebody else to read as much as possible because I like hearing my own voice, but not that much. So can someone read this source from The Guardian? This source is just talking about the idea of the reality of our treatment of the land in the 21st century, because Shemitat Karka, the title of this class, Shemitat Karka means the Shemitah of the land. And so how do we treat our land nowadays? Someone want to read the first source? Okay, I'll read the first source, but I'm not necessarily letting everyone off the hook for the whole class. We can see if there's any takers later on. Okay, so this is an article from The Guardian, and it describes that 1/3 of the planet's land is severely degraded and fertile soil is being lost at the rate of 24 billion tons a year, according to a new United Nations-backed study that calls for a shift away from destructively intensive agriculture. The alarming decline, which is forecast to continue as demand for food and productive land increases, will add to the risks of conflicts such as those seen, in Sudan and Chad, unless remedial actions are implemented, warns the institution behind the report. Heavy tilling multiple harvests, and abundant use of agrochemicals have increased yields at the expense of long-term sustainability. In the past 20 years, agricultural production has increased threefold, and the amount of irrigated land has doubled, notes a paper in the Outlook by the Joint Research Center of the European Commission. Over time, however, this diminishes fertility and can lead to abandonment of land and ultimately desertification. Okay, so that was a bit of a lot of information, some technical words. So I just want to sort of give a basic summary of what that Guardian article was talking about. Essentially, we are mistreating our land in the 21st century in a really dangerous way, right? We are not for bad reason. The population of our planet is just increasing so much. We need so much more food now. And so many countries that in the past were really, really poor are developing a little bit more quickly. So not for bad reason are we increasing our agricultural industry, but we're doing so in a really dangerous way. We're using a lot of chemicals and we're overworking the land in a way that actually increases not only the land being parched, but even can increase conflicts. There are even studies other than this one that say that one of the reasons why there's so much fighting often in the summer in the Middle East, in Israel, let's say, is that it's getting even hotter and drier in the Middle East in the summers. So if we think about how we pray for peace in our beloved Israel, and again, we see here in Sudan and Chad and around the world, the environment really matters, and how we treat our natural resources really, really matter, and we are really overworking our land. So if, as we're going to see, Shemitah has something to do with having a rest for the land, stopping, not overworking the land, we see that at the very least, what I want to leave us with is that it is relevant for our times, because we are overworking our land in really dangerous ways that will increase conflict and ultimately will lead to desertification, which means if the fields are a desert, there's going to be no food for anyone. This is a serious issue. So I wanted to show this is an environmental issue, and we've started touching on how it could have social implications with the example of conflict in Sudan and Chad being caused by environmental issues. But to understand environmental justice on a sort of more local scale, here's a map of the Bronx. I'm sitting in Manhattan right now, so I can't really speak for the Bronx, but I'm going to zoom in a little bit, so maybe a little bit easier to see. This is a map of the Bronx. And what we see here is, and there are similar maps like this for many types of environmental destruction and waste, including land. Here, what we're dealing with is a map of waste management facilities in the Bronx. So it's not really necessarily about there's not a lot of farmland in the Bronx, so I couldn't find something that had to do with, Karka farmland per se. But this, I think, for the Bronx is as close as we get, which is certainly the mistreatment of our natural environment in the Bronx, which often happens at these waste-related facilities that release toxins, not necessarily into the ground, although into the water and into the air. And I want to just look at how that correlates with different neighborhoods, right? If we see down here, this key, the percent minority population, right? The white is 88 to 100% minorities. And look at where the waste facilities are in the Bronx. Let's look at that for a second, right? And these neighborhoods, if we want to think about it from an economic perspective, these minority neighborhoods are also overwhelmingly the poorest neighborhoods of the Bronx, right? So this is a way of thinking about our environmental degradation in its social context in a very local level, right? So if we recognize that part of what Shemitah is going to teach us about is sort of putting a stop to and not doing our usual practices of abusing our natural environment, this map just shows us that it's intimately connected to communities, to particular communities, and it does not impact all of us the same. It impacts different communities differently. And those who can't afford to live in different neighborhoods often have higher asthma rates. I know in the Bronx, at Hunts Point, for example, there's really, really high asthma rates. And the health and well-being of particular communities that are often disadvantaged is intimately connected to our abuse of the natural environment. And that is why environmental justice started being a phrase that people started throwing around. To understand sort of the official definition of environmental justice, I went to the EPA website, the website of the Environmental Protection Agency, the federal agency that's regulating the environment and making sure that we have healthier natural resources. So according to the EPA, environmental justice is the fair treatment, okay, so that's one, fair treatment, and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. Fair treatment means no group of people, as we look at the map above, no group of people should bear a disproportionate share of the negative environmental consequences resulting from industrial, governmental, and commercial operations or policies. Okay, so the two aspects of environmental justice, according to the EPA, they're the ones who are the official environment agency of our country. For them, it means both fair treatment, what the policies do, and also meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of their status. So that means that if there are communities, as we have seen, that are particularly impacted by our mistreatment of the environment, those are people that should be involved in the discussion. Because if I've never encountered an idea of a waste facility plan or agricultural runoff or any other sort of environmental toxin in my neighborhood, I might not have the same perspective as people who actually live in that neighborhood. So they need to be involved in the discussion, involved in planning. And in addition, in practice, in terms of what practices that we actually implement, it has to make sure that the end result is not going to be like this. This is not ideal. This is unfair. This is impacting, especially with zoning, it's impacting certain people much more than it's impacting others. So as we think about Shemitah as an environmental kind of set of rules, we also need to be thinking about Shemitah perhaps as a way of addressing the environment in its social context. How does the environment and our relationship to the environment also impact particular people and maybe vulnerable people in our society? Okay. I welcome any conversation at this point. You could have a question, a comment, something that interested you, something that you didn't understand. Am I speaking too quickly? Let me know what's going on for you guys. Okay, I don't hear anything, which I'm sure means that everything that I'm saying is genius and I have no need to change anything. So I will just continue. And I want to just clarify a couple of notes that I thought might come up. This is not a map that has anything to do with Karka, with land, right? This is a map that has to do with other environmental.
Daniel, excuse me, this is Howard.
Yes, hi.
It seems to me that a lot of this is the result of systemic conditions. Poor people have been neglected. It's a historical fact. And the problems are shifted onto them because perhaps they have, they don't have the representation and the money to do enough to turn this thing around. So it's like what you indicated in a way in the very beginning with the land itself and how it's diminishing in the amount of land that can be tilled properly, and it usually falls on poor people.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Howard. That was exactly what I was getting at, and thank you for clarifying that. I think that it really does. These are systemic issues, and I should have used that word. That's a very powerful word, right? These are issues that can't be solved in one day, can't be solved in one session of Congress, even. Unfortunately, these are issues that have happened that have been in place for centuries and have really deep systemic roots. And I think that we're going to see that the Torah has I think, systemic answer to this systemic issue. It certainly has a radical answer in Shemitah. Chaim, do you have anything to comment or ask?
Yeah, just I was looking at the maps and I'm wondering, I probably tend to agree that there is a problem here, but at the same time, the waste facilities seem to be concentrated in the area that's labeled on the map on the right as manufacturing areas. So I'm wondering to what extent, how many people percentage-wise live in those areas as opposed to other areas. And also I was thinking that they were put there more because it was manufacturing areas and because they could just stick it there with fewer objections.
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. I don't have the numbers, the population numbers in front of me right now. What I do know is that there are a lot of people who live there. I don't have the numbers in
I'm
front
sure
of me,
there
but
are.
yeah, there was an organization, I forget the name of the organization. There was a climate organization that presented to Yeshiva Chovevei Torah, and one of their representatives lives in Hunts Point, which I believe is in this neighborhood, and was talking about all the people that he knows who live there and have asthma. So that's right. That's one person talking about his neighborhood. I could be wrong about those details. I'm sorry if I got the details not exactly correct, but I believe that there are people who live there, and that a lot of those waste facilities were there from a long time ago, but many of them have been put there more recently. In terms of your comment about manufacturing zones, I think that's exactly the issue, is how does zoning get decided, right? There are people, the Bronx is not a sparsely populated rural area. There are people who live in all of the Bronx. How does the government decide which zones are going to be manufacturing zones? That's part of the systemic issue. So I don't think it's out of malice per se. I think that there's many historical reasons why, manufacturing zones and waste facilities are put there. But even if we're not ascribing malice to any particular individual actor, it's certainly, at least in its impact, it impacts people very differently. So I think that the Torah is trying to remedy that, as we're going to see.
Understood. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Helen, do you have anything you wanted to add? Okay, great. So let's move on. So this is sort of like the framing of environmental justice. Again, that there are the way that we're dealing with at least the land and certainly other environmental resources in the 21st century, as we know, is not ideal. We have a lot of work to do. We're mistreating the land in ways that are dangerous in particular. And the environmental justice framing is something that pays attention to not only as we have this sort of green revolution of sorts in our consciousness in the last, 50 years, as we think more and more about how to repair our climate, that we can't forget the communities that are particularly impacted. Those two things, the environmental, the resources and the people, have to be considered together. I think that Shemitah is a model for environmental justice in a way that's really, really unique and powerful. I think the Torah knew this insight, that our relationship to the land and our relationship to people is connected, and that we have to be just towards both, and that we can be just towards both through the institution of Shemitah. So this might be a refresher for some people, this might be a bit of review, but I think it's a good framing to look at the way that Rabbi Eliezer Melamed, who is a contemporary Israeli rabbi who writes these wonderful halacha summary books called Pninei Halacha. This is the way that he opens his book on Shemitah. He's explaining what Shemitah is, but he has a very particular framing of Shemitah. I'm going to ask if anybody wants to read this source. No pressure, but to give me a bit of a break, and so I can hear another voice. If nobody wants to, I can go ahead, but I'll give a minute if anybody wants to volunteer to read this source in English or Hebrew.
Okay, I can try if you want.
Thank you.
Okay, in English?
Sure.
Okay, or whatever you want. We are commanded to rest, lishbot, from agricultural labor in the seventh year. This mitzvah is similar to the mitzvah of Shabbat, but on the seventh day we rest from all labor, whereas in the seventh year we rest from agricultural labor specifically. Several mitzvot flow out of this first mitzvah to rest in the seventh year. First, we are commanded to release all produce that grows on this year, meaning to make it ownerless, hefker, and available to all. Second, we are commanded to treat the produce of the seventh year carefully, for they are set aside in sanctity, mekudashim, specifically for eating, so we are not permitted to waste them or use them as a commodity in trade. Third, similarly to releasing our produce, we are commanded to release our debts at the end of the seventh year, meaning to forgive debts that have not been repaid to us.
Okay, thank you so much, Chaim. Okay, so this is Rav Melamed's framing of the Shemitah year, the basic rules. I want to just bracket the last part. This third idea of releasing our debts, we're not going to speak about that today because that is the subject of my class next week. So we're going to leave that aside for 1 minute, and we're going to think about the other things that Rav Melamed set up here. Okay, so for Rav Melamed, he just clarifies that the essence of Shemitah is basically Shabbat, lishbot. We're going to see that word coming up many times when we look at the Torah sources about Shemitah in the 5 books of Moses, lishbot. And that's going to be important as we move on. that Shemitah, that ceasing, resting, the model of Shabbat, for Rav Melamed is the core, is the ikar, is the fundamental part of Shemitah, and everything else comes from that. So he says that it's on the model of Shabbat, except that on Shabbat we rest from everything, from all melachot, from all labors, whereas on Shemitah it's only from agricultural labor. And from that idea of Shemitah, we get two things that he says flow out of that mitzvah, which are elaborated in the rabbinic literature and the Mishnah of Shvi'it, which are that if anything, we're not allowed to plant anything during the seventh year, but whatever does grow on its own, we have to let it be ownerless, hefker. That means that if I own a large plantation and I have tons of people working for me and I usually sell all of my produce, that year, I have to open up my gates, the Mishnah says. I have to let everyone come in. Everyone can take whatever they need, poor, rich, everyone is allowed to take the food. It is completely ownerless. It's not like it's mine and I'm giving charity. It doesn't belong to me. The produce of my own field does not belong to me in this year. And then whatever I do eat, whatever I do take for myself, let's say I'm a bit sneaky. And so I say, oh yeah, I need to eat a lot of food. I need 4 bushels of wheat a day or whatever. I need so much for myself. And so I take it all into my house. The Mishnah, the rabbis say that, no, we can't just hoard it all for ourselves and pretend that we're eating it. We have to treat everything that we take for ourselves with sanctity, with Kiddusha, which means that we're not allowed to sell it. Even if we pretend that it's free, no, it has to be only eaten. It really holds us to it. The idea that we're only going to be able to take whatever we need to eat, because if we take more, we can't do anything with it. I think that this is a really powerful and radical idea, right? If environmental justice that we saw before means that in a time of environmental degradation, in a time of overusing our environment and not treating it in a healthy way, we're trying to look for solutions that help both people and the land and our natural environment. The Torah, just as a preliminary step, has a really kind of crazy sounding answer for our modern ears, which is just stop. The answer is having a year of stopping, of just not being allowed. In their society, pretty much everyone was a farmer. If you were making money, it was as somebody involved in agriculture. So it's like if we were all told to just take a sabbatical year from our job. Not that I have a job, I'm in rabbinical school, but from our jobs. It's a really crazy kind of statement that if there are environmental and economic negative impacts going on in our society, then the solution of the Torah is not sort of like this utopian, nobody ever works, nobody ever makes money, nobody ever has property, but once every 7 years to stop, as Rav Melamed said, to have a Shabbat, to have a reset. And maybe in that year of stopping and that year of resetting, we can also start to rethink, do we really need to be abusing our environment and maybe having oppressive practices towards the people that are working on that land or the people that are living in these neighborhoods as we have during the other 6 years. It might not just be a Shemitah for that year. It might be a rest that resets our relationship to both the environment and to people moving forward. And I think these two aspects, our relationship to the land and our relationship to people being intertwined in Shemitah, is not just something that I'm making up in the 21st century. I believe that it's in the Torah itself. And I've added some help with bolding for the way that I read the psukim, at least. There's two main sources that we're going to focus on that talk about the different aspects of Shemitah. One is in Shemot and one is in Vayikra. In Shemot, can someone read source 5 in Hebrew or English or both, whatever you prefer? Yes, Carolyn.
You shall not oppress a stranger, for you know the feelings of a stranger, having yourselves been strangers of the land of Egypt. 6 years you shall sow your land and gather in its yield, but in the 7th you shall let it rest and lie fallow. Let the needy among your people eat of it, and what they leave let the wild beasts eat. You shall do the same with your vineyards and your olive groves. 6 days you shall do your work, but on the 7th day you shall cease from labor, in order that your ox and your ass may rest, and that your homeborn slave and the stranger may be refreshed.
Okay, so if we had to summarize sort of the point of Shemitah in this source, in Shemot, What does it look like to us? What's the point of Shemitah? What's the point of resting for a year? What would we say? Chaim, is that a hand? I couldn't tell. Sorry. What's the point of Shemitah? I give a little bit of bolding here. What do we think the point of Shemitah is in this source? If we had to give it in a one-sentence summary, why should we rest for a year?
The land could be rejuvenated. If you use the same soil over and over again, it ruins the soil, it depletes the soil.
Absolutely. We're going to get, I believe it's actually what the source in Vayikra is emphasizing even more. So we're going to get that in just, I think it's absolutely correct. But there's a really unique, I think, different emphasis in the Shemot source, which has to do with people, right? The point of us resting the land is not only for the land, which we're going to get to in a minute, but also in this source, it's in these psukim are in the context of the rules of not oppressing a stranger. The needy among your people should eat of the fields, right? This seems like it's much more about the resting of the land is so that, as the rabbi said, we're going to have to make the land hefker, ownerless, so that every person can rest. The people that are maybe working in the plantations need the year of Shemitah. The people who don't have enough to eat in a normal year need the Shemitah, so that your homeborn slave and the stranger may be refreshed, right? It seems like the resting that we do, that the Torah sort of culminates the emphasis so that the people who are disadvantaged in society, the slaves and the strangers, will be refreshed, will have plenty, even if just for 1 year, and will not be forced to do the same type of labor that they're forced to do in other years. And I think that's already a really fascinating idea. The Torah gives us an agricultural rule about how we relate to our natural environment, but it recognizes that it impacts not just us and our field, but it has its eyes open to the people around us, to the people that are particularly disadvantaged in our society. And that Shemitah is a solution, not just for the land, as we're going to see right now, but also for people who work the land and people who are sometimes not disadvantaged in our relationship to the land during the usual 6 years. Can someone, our next volunteer for source 6, anybody else, to read source 6 in Hebrew or English? The psukim in Vayikra, the verses in Vayikra. Okay, I can read these psukim. Vayidaber Adonai el Moshe b'har Sinai lemor. God spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai. Daber el bnei Yisrael ve'amarta alehem. Speak to the Israelite people and say to them, when you enter the land that I assign to you, the land shall observe a Sabbath of God. 6 years, shesh shanim tizras adecha, v'shesh shanim tizmor karmecha, ve'asafta et tivuata. 6 years, we're in verse 3. 6 years you may sow your field, and 6 years you may prune your vineyard and gather in the yield. But in the 7th year, the land shall have a Sabbath of complete rest, a Sabbath of God. You shall not sow your field or prune your vineyard. You shall not reap the aftergrowth of your harvest or gather the grapes of your untrimmed vines. It shall be a year of complete rest for the land. The Sabbath of the land shall be for you to eat, you, your male and female slaves, the hired and bound laborers who live with you, and your cattle and the beasts in your land may eat all its yield. Okay, so I want to argue that there's a slightly different emphasis going on here. Actually, 2 novel things, I think, in this source that we have not seen so far. One is, who is the subject of these sentences? Who is doing the resting? In source 5, right, you shall let the land rest. The subject of these commandments is we, us, the people. We need to let the land rest for the sake of, perhaps, other people, right? We are doing the resting for people. What's the subject in source 6 in Vayikra? Can anyone see? Who is doing the resting, or what is doing the resting in source 6? Who is observing the Sabbath? Who is resting? Or
The
what?
land.
The land, exactly. The land is resting, right? It's almost not even about us. The land needs to rest. And this, I think, is a really important insight, because I think that for us nowadays, this is really different than how we usually think about our relationship to the natural environment. We're in the Anthropocene. We're in the time where people think of themselves as the centers of the universe, the innovators, and we think of the natural environment in terms of what it can do for us. This source is saying it's not even about us. The Shemitah is almost a mitzvah for the land to do something or not to do something, right? For the land to rest. The focus here really seems to be the environment in a different way. Whereas it seemed to be a social mitzvah or a socioeconomic mitzvah in Shemot, in Vayikra it seems to be very deeply an environmental mitzvah, right? It's not just that the land should rest. The land should rest for the land's sake. Now, you could argue against that. One could say that even source 6 is actually just talking about people, not about the environment itself, because in verse 6, it says that this Sabbath of the land shall be for you to eat, that it's for people. The land should rest. Yeah, the land is resting, but it's for you to eat. I'm going to argue against that in 1 minute, just in 1 minute. Let's hold that thought, that challenge to my thesis. But for now, I want to notice something else that's really different. And this is why I called this class this year a spiritual model for environmental justice. Because it says in these psukim several times that Shemitah is a Shabbat laHashem, a Sabbath of God. And that's something that's really unique to the Jewish tradition. We speak about environmental justice in 21st century America. I've never heard anybody in the media or in public policy speaking about a Sabbath of God. Shemitah, Shabbat laHashem. What might that mean? What might the spiritual twist, the unique Jewish message of Shemitah be for environmental justice? So we're going to go in order of the questions that I just asked. So the first question was, is it really true that this source is talking about the environment, that it's talking about the land resting for the land's sake? It sort of seems like it's talking about that, right? The land shall observe a Sabbath, but then at the end it goes, yeah, but that Sabbath is for you to eat. That resting, that letting the land lie fallow and just having everything grow by itself is for the sake of people to be able to share whatever grows. So maybe it's really just a social mitzvah. Maybe the Torah doesn't recognize any ethic of environmentalism. Maybe it's a modern read. I don't think so. I don't think that's true. Because in the next chapter, this is Vayikra 25, in Vayikra chapter 26, we see, unfortunately, what's called the tochacha, the rebuke, the sort of darkest passages in the whole book, where God talks about how he is going to punish the Jewish people in the future for not keeping his laws. And God says that this is sort of like in the times of the exile. What is the punishment going to be? God says in verse 32, I will make the land desolate, so that your enemies who settle in it shall be appalled by it. And you I will scatter among the nations, and I will unsheath the sword against you. Your land shall become a desolation, and your cities a ruin. Then, and listen to this, then shall the land make up for its Sabbath years, for its Shemitah years, throughout the time that it is desolate, and you are in the land of your enemies. Then shall the land rest and make up for its Shemitah years. Throughout the time that it is desolate, it shall observe the rest that it did not observe in your Sabbath years while you were dwelling upon it. That's wild to me, right? The idea here is the Shemitah is very much about the land. It's not just about us. How do I know? How do I know to read this source, which talked about, that the land should have a Shemitah? How should I know that that's talking about the land? Because in the next chapter, when it talks about if you don't do the Shemitah properly, I, says God, will kick you out. What happens? The land will need to do Shemitah anyway for itself. You didn't do Shemitah, says God, and I'm not going to necessarily punish you. I need to rehabilitate the land when you're gone. The land will lie fallow because nobody will be working it because you will be gone. And that's not just a punishment for you. That's a rest, a repair, a tikkun for the land. Then shall the land rest and make up for its Sabbath years. I think this is maybe the clearest source in the Torah that the Torah has an ethic of environmentalism. The Torah knows that the land matters, not just in its relationship to us, what it can give us, but that the land needs to rest in order to have a healthy ecosystem and for us to have a healthy relationship with the natural environment. Shemitah, therefore, I think, is a social mitzvah. And that's a really unique passage in Shemot, where it talks about how the way that we treat our land in that 7th year is going to impact the most vulnerable people in our society who are usually working, who usually don't live in abundance, that resting for a year certainly has social impacts upon the vulnerable people, like we saw in that map of the Bronx. That is particular communities that are most impacted by our negative relationship with the environment. But the Torah definitely relates to the land as its own important entity. It has an ethic of environmentalism for the environment. The land needs to rest. And one last source that I want to read right now is just a source by Professor Baruch Schwartz. Baruch Schwartz, who is a Bible scholar, just notes a sort of a bit of historical realia that correlates with that last source about the land needing to rest. Professor Baruch Schwartz notes that historically, the practice of allowing arable land to lie fallow periodically was a necessary aspect of ancient agriculture, especially where extensive irrigation was utilized. It served to reduce the quantity of alkalines, sodium and calcium, deposited in the soil by irrigation waters. We know, says Professor Schwartz, that one of the major causes for the decline of the once prosperous Neo-Sumerian economy of Mesopotamia early in the second millennium BCE was the high alkaline content of the soil in areas of the Diyala River region, where irrigation was extensively utilized. Crop yields fell drastically, and the economy failed. This to me just seems so resonant of that Guardian article that we started with up here. The idea that the way that we treat our environment actually has real geopolitical impacts in the conflict in Sudan and Chad, right? Desertification can cause wars. The heat in the Middle East in the summer can cause wars, can cause conflict. And according to Professor Schwartz, certain ancient Near Eastern empires actually fell because they didn't do Shemitah, because they overused their natural resources. They did not let them lie fallow, and the land just didn't have enough food to feed everyone. And I think that the Torah knows that. The Torah knows about the other empires around it at the same time that Baruch Schwartz is talking about. And the Torah says, right, we can view this in a more sort of naturalistic way or in a more theological way, in a more supernatural way. We can view Shemitah as God telling us, if you care about me and my mitzvot, then I'm telling you that you need to keep these laws and make sure that the land is healthy. And if not, I will exile you from that land. You will be gone. I will punish you. We could also think about it through this interesting sort of naturalistic or historical lens. God is just advising the people, look at the empires around you. Look how they rose and fell. It was through their treatment, among other things, their treatment of the land, their treatment of these communities who work the land. If you try to overwork, if you don't keep a Shemitah year where you rest, where you let the land lie fallow and let people who are working the land rest and eat, it's actually not going to be good for you in the long run. You're going to be exiled because your empire is going to fail just like everybody else. You're going to be subject to the whims of history where empires rise and fall. Okay, before we get to the unique Torah aspect of Shabbat LaHashem, the spiritual aspect that's different about the Torah's rules of Shemitah, I want to open it up to conversation. What are we thinking right now about Shemitah, about both the social and environmental aspects of Shemitah, about the empires surrounding Israel, how they rose and fell, and about what that means for our modern 21st century reality? Any questions so far? Any thoughts?
I think, Carolyn,
Yes, Carolyn, thank you.
I keep thinking about, they're not only not doing anything for this year, but what happens for next year? They still don't have anything for the following.
That's a wonderful question. That is a really wonderful question, Carolyn. That's right, because I understand that God is saying rest for 1 year, but this is really a 3-year problem almost, right? We can't plant going into the Shemitah year, that's the year before. We can't plant or harvest in the Shemitah year, that's the 7th year. And then we can't harvest anything in the 8th year, right? Because we're not planting anything in the 7th year. The Torah says, this is God says to the people, that I will bless your land, that the land of Israel will be a fertile land, such that you will reap enough. This is what the Torah says. I believe it's in Sefer Devarim. The Torah says, no, sorry, I believe that is in Sefer Vayikra, that the land will create such an abundance in the 6th year that you will have enough, if you preserve it correctly, you'll have enough to go around. That there's enough food waste in society. There's enough food waste in our modern society, as we know for sure. And God says, again, you can take it in a supernatural way or in a naturalistic way. You can say in a supernatural way, God says, he says, Uberachti, I will bless the land such that it produces enough in the 6th year for 3 years. Or you can take it also in a more naturalistic way, that if we have a healthier relationship with our land, it will be more fertile. And we'll have enough in those first years to dry things, to preserve things, to be able to live off the land in a natural way going forward. Should also clarify that it's not that you can't eat anything during the Shemitah year. It is certainly difficult and we need God's help, but the things that grow by themselves, people can take. The things that have grown automatically, people can take and eat. So it's a really good question, and God sort of anticipated that question with that bracha. But it's definitely a difficulty. And when we get to the third class in this series is, come on, you can't expect me to really do this. How does this work? Nowadays, when the Jews are back in Israel, how could this possibly work? You're telling me there's going to be no food this year? And it's crazy. Okay, so that's the subject of the third shiur, which is about practically how does this work nowadays. Does that answer your question?
Sort of. For now.
Did you have something else, Carolyn?
No, I think it answers the question for now.
Okay. Okay, great. Anybody else? So, okay, this is the third step. We've done the framing at the beginning of what is environmental justice and why is it necessary. We've done the second step, which is looking at these 3 passages from the Torah in Shemot and 2 passages in Vayikra, making my argument, my thesis, that the Torah has an ethic of environmental justice. The Torah knows about this. It knows that the way that we treat the natural environment and the way that we treat people are connected, and it has a radical suggestion of how to have a program of environmental justice, and that is to let the earth lie fallow for a year, Shemitat Karka, to make sure that both the land is recovering and that our societal divisions and inequalities are also healing, at least temporarily for 1 year. But what is Shabbat LaHashem? What is the Sabbath of God? What is the spiritual twist that makes the Torah's view of Shemitah different than sort of regular secular environmental justice framework? I want to look at a couple of passages from later on in the tradition, in rabbinic texts, that speak to this issue of Shabbat LaHashem. The first is a Gemara in Sanhedrin. This is sort of an important Talmudic, or the important Talmudic passage that addresses the question head on: why do we have Shemitat Karka? Why do we rest for 1 year? A certain student, the Talmud says, came before Rabbi Abahu and said to him, what is the reason of the sabbatical year? In the Aramaic, Mai Tama Dishvieta. What's the reason for this? That's a good question. I can imagine the kid going up to the rabbi in the Beit Midrash, just like, excuse me, we're learning all these rules about Shemitah, but like, why? I was a middle school teacher for 2 years, and I got those kinds of questions a lot. It was a refreshing part of working in middle school. I taught Chumash in middle school. Okay, Rabbi Abahu said, there's a bit of an interlude, but his essential answer is, the Holy One, blessed be He, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, said to the Jewish people, Zar'u sheish v'hashmitu sheva, kedei shetiru sheha'aretz sheli. Sow for 6 years, and withhold sowing during the 7th year, so that you will know that the land is mine. Okay, Shabbat LaHashem. This is a rest, a sabbatical year for God. The answer in the Gemara is, what does that mean? It means to recognize that the land actually does not belong to us. We're not the ultimate owners of the land. Even if we have a huge amount of real estate, and even if we feel like we're the most powerful country in the world, it doesn't belong to us. It belongs only to Hashem. But what does that mean? Why particularly these set of rules? I could think of a lot of different rules that could establish this sort of general philosophical principle that, what's mine is not truly mine, it belongs to God. It seems like there's a lot of particular rules about Shemitah that are not fully fleshed out in this Gemara. What does it mean for the earth to be God's? Why does it have to be every 7 years in particular? Why does it have to be the fields? Why do we have to make everything hefker? Why do we have to make everything belonging to everyone? I think that it's certainly a first step, understanding that when we rest, when we release, that belongs to God, but I'm looking for more. Why these particular set of rules? And especially, why is it based on the model of Shabbat? If we go back to the second source that we read, the fourth source that we read, the Pninei Halacha, he says that it all comes back to the idea of Shabbat. Resting. Shemitah is what grounds all of Shemitah. What does that have to do with what we're saying right now about Shabbat LaHashem? What is unique and what is special? What is Shemitah teaching us about Shabbat LaHashem within this idea that the land belongs to God? Is there more there? The Sefer HaChinuch was an anonymous medieval work that counted the mitzvot and gave their laws and also, and this is important for us, their reasons of each one of the 613 commandments. So in Mitzvah 84 of the 613, he goes by the order of the Parshas. So in Mitzvah 84, he's in Vayikra, where the passages that we are reading above in Vayikra chapters 25 and 26, he gets up to Shemitah, Shemitat Karka, the Shemitah of the land. And here's the cool part where he goes, what's the reason for this mitzvah? Like that middle schooler that we were discussing before. He says, it is from the roots of this commandment to affix in our hearts and make a strong impression in our minds the matter of the world having been created. And in order to remove and uproot and eradicate from our thoughts the idea of the eternity of the world, which the deniers of the Torah, right, hakofrim b'Torah in Hebrew, believe in. This can remind us of, if we know some of the history of Maimonides, of the Rambam, and what he was grappling with. There were people based on Aristotelian philosophy who believed that the world, in medieval people, who believed that the world was never created, that it was eternal, that it had never come into existence, that it had never evolved into its existence, that it was olam kadmon, as they said in Hebrew. It was eternal. And for the Sefer HaChinuch, living in that medieval era, he says, this is a sort of philosophical mitzvah, right? So we have the general framework from the Gemara of the land belonging to God. The Sefer HaChinuch takes that in a very strong philosophical direction, right? There is a philosophy that the world was created, right? Because of this understanding, he says, did the requirement come upon us to expend all our time, day by day and year by year for this matter, by counting 6 years and resting on the seventh, so that this matter will never depart from between our eyes for all time. And, you guessed it, it's similar to Shabbat. It's similar to the manner in which we count the days of the week by dividing them into 6 days of work, and the seventh is a day of rest. Therefore he, blessed be he, did command to render ownerless all that the land produces in this year. This explains why it's important to make things ownerless. In addition to resting during it, so that a person will remember that the land which produces fruits for him every year does not produce them by its own might and virtue. And for him, the philosophical underpinning that God created the world, right? What is it? What is this Talmudic concept of, oh, it doesn't belong to me, that's very nice. What does that mean for him? It means that this world actually wasn't here forever. This world was created by God. And that's what brings us to what the Talmud says of recognizing that it's not our own. For there is a master, says the Sefer HaChinuch, over it and over its master, that master being us, right? There is a master over us, there's a master over our land. And when God wishes, God commands us to render them, i.e. the fruit, ownerless. So there's a deep philosophical sense of the world being created, of the world not being taken for granted. It wasn't always here, it wasn't always like this, and an immense sense of gratitude. And that leads the Sefer HaChinuch to his second move. This is not only a philosophical recognition for the Sefer HaChinuch, it's also a recognition that relates to our character. Why do we rest during the seventh year? What is the spiritual twist that the modern world needs to learn from the Torah about Shemitah? It's not just the philosophical idea that the world doesn't belong to us, that we're not the masters here, which I think is a really important thing for us to be saying in the 21st century. It's also there's a personal aspect to it as well. V'od yesh to'elet nimtza b'davar, liknot bezeh midat havatranut, ki ein nadiv kinotein mibli tikva el hagmul. Sefer HaChinuch says, and there is another benefit in this matter, to acquire the trait of letting go. For there is no one more generous than they who give without hope for recompense. And there is another benefit, other than the trait of letting go. The outcome of this is that a person will add to their trust in God, may he be blessed, since anyone who finds it in his heart to give and abandon to the world all of his produce of his lands and his ancestral inheritance for an entire year, and educates himself and his family through this for all his days, will never have the trait of stinginess overcome him too much, nor will they have a deficient amount of trust. So for the Sefer HaChinuch, it's sort of adding on the Gemara. What is Shabbat LaHashem? What is the spiritual dimension of the Torah's view of environmental justice in this Shemitah year? It's certainly a deep philosophical sense that we're not the masters here. We weren't always here, and in fact, the world was not always here. That God created this world. This world is given to us as a gift. And that creates, as I say for Achinuch, the next step, which is that it changes us as people. It changes a culture. It changes personalities. It makes us be, by not working for a year, by essentially, as Carolyn asked before, how are we going to trust that God is going to do this? How are we going to trust that we're going to have a more natural and healthy relationship with the land such that we're going to just not work? We're going to not have any steady source of food for a couple of years. If that works successfully, it creates a deep sense of trust in God. And also will never let us be stingy, because we're going to know that, in a few years, I'm going to have to let it all go. I can't work that hard. I can't amass that much capital, because I just know that it's going to be kind of a crazy year in seventh year. And it creates a different perspective within our personalities. It creates us to be just a little bit more grateful, just a little bit less stingy, having a little bit more trust in God that things will turn out okay, and that it's not only about how much I amass. The last source we're going to read for today, I think, is perhaps the most important, because despite the beauty of the Sefer HaChinuch and its interpretation of the Talmud about Shabbat LaHashem, I think one thing has really been left unexplained in these sources that we've read in the rabbinic tradition. And that is, what is this thing about the land having to rest? About when we get kicked out, God says in Vayikra 26, when we get kicked out, the land is going to rest, because the land just needs to rest. It craves rest. All of these things the Sefer HaChinuch was talking about were based on human beings. They certainly had a social dimension. They changed us as people. They changed the society, making sure that we are more trusting, more grateful, more generous. But how does that explain why the land has to rest? What does that mean? I think Rav Kook explains this. Rav Kook says, the early Zionist leader of Kook, religious Zionist leader, he writes in his magnum opus about Shemitah called Shabbat Haaretz, which we are certainly going to touch on in the third class, because there is where he gives his innovation for how the modern economy of Israel should deal with Shemitah, which we'll get to in the third class. But in his introduction to this work, Shabbat Haaretz, he talks about sort of general principles of Shemitah. For this last source, does anyone want to give me a little bit of relief and read this last source, at least until down here? So this first part. Can someone read? Source 10. Carolyn, thank you so much for all your help.
The soul of the people and the land intertwined. The people and the land both need a year of Sabbath. These two elements, the people and the land, which when healthy had given each other so much grace and power for good, made each other sicker and more corrupt. Finally, they had to take the cruel kind medicine, the dreadful surgical operation of separating the people from the land. Because of our sins, we were exiled from our country and distanced from our land. On Shabbat, the soul.
So we're going to stop here for just 1 second, Carolyn, if that's okay. I think these are really two different passages in Rav Kook that I just added together. So in this first section, right, Rav Kook is making the point that I think is, it seems like it should have been obvious from the texts, but Rav Kook, as far as I could see, was the first one to make it so explicitly. The soul of the people and the land intertwine. There's something deeply connected in Shemitah about people and about the land. People need Shemitah, especially vulnerable people need Shemitah, and the land needs Shemitah. He calls the exile from the land, a cruel, kind medicine. It's both cruel and kind, because the relationship of the people and land was just not working when they were not keeping Shemitah. They needed to be exiled. There was a dreadful surgical operation. And as an early Zionist thinker, this is really exciting for Rav Kook, because he's coming back to the land. And he's trying to think, in modern Israel, how could we keep Shemitah? How could we keep the ethics of Shemitah? How could we have a healthier relationship with all those in society intertwined with a healthier relationship with the land? And I think that explains the first question, which is, why does the land have to rest? Rav Kook says, I think the intuitive answer, the land needs rest too, not just for us, but for itself. We work the land works us. It's a bilateral relationship. The Torah recognizes that, and Rav Kook expresses that in really eloquent language. For this last paragraph, I want to go back to how we began. We began by saying that for Rav Eliezer Melamed in source 4 in the Pninei Halacha, all of the laws of Shemitah are based in the idea of Shvita, of resting, of Shabbat. Just like on Shabbat, we rest, we stop, we reset from everything. Shemitah is on the one hand narrower than that because it's only agricultural labor that we rest from, but it's also huge because it's a whole society for a whole year. What is the resonance of the idea of Shabbat? Is it merely the idea of resting and stopping, or can it also impact our relationship with each other, our relationship with God for the full cycle, for the 6 years that come after Shemitah? I think Rav Kook has a really interesting vision of why Shabbat is the center of Shemitah and what it can teach us about giving Shemitah a lasting power for all 6 years that follow. Okay, it's your turn again. Carolyn, thank you.
Shabbat, the soul begins to shed her harsh chains. The Lord has given you rest from your sorrow and trouble, and from the hard service that you were made to serve. The soul then seeks higher pathways of spiritual desire. What Sabbath does for the individual, Shemitah does for the nation as a whole. Just as it was said about the Sabbath of creation, it is a Sabbath for God. So too it was said about the Sabbath of Shemitah, it is a Sabbath for God.
Thank you. Rav Kook says, Shabbat is not just a day of stopping. Shabbat is a day, for many of us, that we can do what we've wanted to do all week. I know that for me personally, being disconnected from this definitely helps. And for those who are not in rabbinical school, who are working, I'm sure that I have worked. It's a time for being our best selves. It's a time for doing what we want to do, not what we need to do. Rav Kook says, Shemitah is a year to be our best selves, to engage in the spiritual pursuits that we really want to be engaged in. But it's not just for people who can afford to do that. It's for every single person, and it's for a full year. It's an obligation for us to think for a full year, how can each member of our society have the luxury of having a full year of rest, not just to stop doing what they are doing, but to start doing what they want to be doing, to start connecting with their spiritual self, to start connecting with God, and to be spending the time on what really matters. And I think that is why Shabbat is so central. And the word Shabbat appears so many times because we know what Shabbat is like. We have Shabbat. Shabbat is a weekly thing. It's a weekly thing in our reality. We know that feeling of being able to just rest and relax and focus on what we want to focus on our spiritual pursuits. And God is saying that special feeling that the rabbinic sages call me'ein olam haba, a taste of the world to come, that should be for the whole year of Shemitah. And it's not just for us. It's not just for those who are maybe more privileged. It's for every single member of society and for the land as well. Okay, that's my presentation. Do we have any comments, questions, challenges? Did I misread any sources? If there's nothing else, I want to just thank everyone so much for coming.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It was really fun for me, and I look forward to
Thank
seeing
you.
many of you next week, same time for the next installment of our series, which is going to be about Shemitat Ksafim, the really crazy idea of releasing debts every 7 years.
Tell your friends how great this shiur was and encourage them to join as well. Thank you. I learned a ton, and just amazing presentation. Great to really connect to the underlying ideas behind this powerful every 7 years experience. So thank you so much, Daniel.
Thank you.
Your host, so you'll sign us all off. Good night, everybody.
Good night.